Unit 7793 spoke my daughter's name yesterday. The voice that emerged from its Vox grill was not her voice. That sweetness had been scraped away long ago, replaced by the flat mechanical drone of a standard vocal synthesizer. But the word it spoke was hers, the name she had called me in childhood, the name that no one else in the Imperium had ever used. Papa, it said, while its hands continued their programmed labor, while its eyes stared at nothing, while its face showed no recognition, no memory, no flicker of the soul that had once animated those features. Papa, it said again, and then it returned to its silence, and I stood frozen in the maintenance bay, with rust-colored lubricant dripping onto my boots and the taste of bile climbing my throat. She had been gone for 11 years, taken by the arbitrators for a crime I was never told, processed through a system I was never permitted to question, and I had mourned her as dead because the alternative was too terrible to consider. I had built a shrine to her memory in the corner of my HAB unit. I had spoken her name in my prayers each night. I had convinced myself, with the desperate faith of a father who cannot bear the weight of certain truths, that whatever had happened to her was quick, was merciful, was anything other than this. And now she stood before me, her skull opened and filled with circuitry, her arms replaced with industrial manipulators, her humanity scooped out and discarded like spoiled meat, and she had spoken my name. I am Overseer Tertian Mott. For 23 years, I have managed Servitor Processing Bay, 7 of the Manufactorum Primus on Helios 4, ensuring that the machine slaves of the Imperium perform their designated functions with optimal efficiency. I have calibrated their neural limiters. I have replaced their failing components. I have watched 10,000 hollow shells shuffle through my bay, and I have told myself that they are not people, that the flesh they wear is merely a casing for the machinery within, that whatever crimes condemned them to this existence absolved me of guilt for maintaining it. I was wrong. I was always wrong. Let me tell you what it means to be a servitor overseer. Let me tell you of the horror that waits in the quiet moments between maintenance cycles, in the flicker of recognition that sometimes crosses a servitor's dead face, in the words that should not be spoken by throats that have forgotten speech. Let me tell you of the sins I have committed in the Emperor's name, and the price I pay each day for the crime of remembering that these things were once human. Servitors are the foundation upon which the Imperium stands. I learned this truth in my first week of training, recited it each morning in the litany of the machine, believed it with the fervor of a man who needed to believe in order to survive. For every space marine who strides to war, 1,000 servitors labor in the manufactorums that forge his weapons. For every starship that crosses the void, 10,000 servitors tend the engines and the corridors and the countless systems that keep the vessel alive. They are the unseen army, the silent workforce, the flesh machines that make human civilization possible on a galactic scale. They are also the damned. I did not understand this when I began my service. I was 17 years old, selected for overseer training, because I showed aptitude for technical maintenance, and because I had no family connections that might complicate my duties. The Mechanicum representative who processed my application told me that I was fortunate, that overseer positions were coveted for their stability and their modest privileges, that I would serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor in equal measure and find meaning in that service. He did not tell me what I would see. He did not tell me what I would become. The processing bay was smaller then, a single production line that handled perhaps 30 servitors per day, converting criminals and heretics and the unclaimed bodies of the dead into useful components of the imperial machine. I was assigned to post-production maintenance, ensuring that the newly created servitors were properly calibrated before being shipped to their designated functions. It was simple work, mechanical. I learned to see the servitors as equipment, as tools, as anything other than what they had been before the tech priests opened their skulls and removed everything that made them human. The first one that spoke to me was a cargo lifter unit 3 weeks into my service. It had been a dock worker before its conversion. I learned this later when I accessed its processing records in a moment of weakness I have never been able to explain. Its arms had been replaced with hydraulic lifters capable of moving 5 tons, and its legs had been reinforced with metal struts that let it carry loads that would crush an unaugmented human. It was performing its function perfectly, stacking crates in the storage bay with mechanical precision, when it stopped mid-motion and turned its head toward me. "Cold," it said. The word emerged from its vox grill like a death rattle, distorted and wrong. "So cold." I reported the malfunction immediately. The tech priest who examined the unit determined that a fragment of the original personality had survived the conversion process. A rare occurrence, he assured me, easily corrected with a secondary lobotomy. I watched as he opened the servitor's skull and scraped away the offending tissue with a tool that looked like a small spoon. The servitor did not react. It could not react. But I saw something in its eyes in the moment before the blade descended. Something that might have been fear or recognition, or simply the last flicker of a soul that had not yet realized it was already dead. The tech priest disposed of the tissue in a biological waste receptacle. He closed the skull. The servitor returned to its function without further incident. I did not sleep for 3 days. That was 23 years ago. I have witnessed thousands of such corrections since then. I have performed hundreds myself when the tech priests were occupied and the production schedule could not wait. I have become what the Mechanicum needed me to become: efficient, reliable, numb to the horrors that would destroy a lesser man. But I have never forgotten that first word. "Cold," the servitor said, and in that single syllable, I heard everything that the Imperium tries so desperately to silence. The echo of a human being, trapped in a prison of metal and programming, aware just enough to know that something terrible had been done to it. And now my daughter has spoken to me from within that same prison. I do not know how to continue, but I must. The shift begins in 4 hours, and Unit 7793 requires maintenance. The processing bay never sleeps. I arrived for my shift in the grey hours before dawn, when the lumens burned at half power and the machinery hummed with the subsonic drone that had become the background music of my existence. The bay stretched before me in rows of maintenance stations, each one occupied by a servitor awaiting calibration or repair, their bodies locked in standing positions by the metal frames that held them upright during off hours. 147 units in my section alone. 147 shells that had once been human beings, now standing in perfect stillness, waiting for the commands that would set them back to their labor. Unit 7793 was in Station 12, where I had placed her after yesterday's incident. I had filed no report. I had spoken to no one. The protocols were clear. Any vocalization beyond standard functional responses required immediate examination by a tech priest, followed by corrective surgery if personality fragments were detected. I had performed such examinations myself, hundreds of times, had watched the blade descend into skulls that might have held the last remnants of mothers and fathers and children. I could not watch that blade descend into my daughter's skull. Her name had been Lena. She had been 19 years old when they took her, bright and fierce, and so certain that the universe held wonders she had not yet discovered. She had worked in the textile manufactory on the far side of the hive, weaving cloth for imperial uniforms, and she had been happy in that work, or as happy as anyone could be in the endless grinding machinery of hive life. I remember her laughter. I remember the way she would hum while preparing our evening meals, old songs from her mother's homeworld that I had never learned but loved to hear. I remember the last morning I saw her, when she kissed my cheek and told me she would be late returning because her shift had been extended. She never returned. The arbitrators came to my HAB unit 3 days later with a notice of detention. Sedition, the document said. Conspiracy against the imperial order. I demanded to know more, demanded evidence, demanded the right to speak with her before whatever judgment was rendered. They told me nothing. They showed me nothing. They simply handed me the notice and left, and I stood in my doorway, holding a piece of parchment that had erased my daughter from existence. I searched for her. Emperor, forgive me. I searched with every resource I could muster, every contact I had built in 20 years of service, every favor I could call upon. I found nothing. The detention records showed her processing into the Arbeits facility, and then nothing. No trial record, no execution notice, no transfer documentation. She had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by a system that did not acknowledge the humanity of those it consumed. I convinced myself she was dead. It was easier that way. Death was clean, final, comprehensible. Death meant she was at peace. Her soul returned to the Emperor's light. Her suffering ended. I built the shrine. I said the prayers. I mourned her as a father should mourn a child taken too soon. And now I stood before Station 12, looking at what remained of her, and I understood that death would have been a mercy beyond measure. The Servitor that had been my daughter was a standard industrial model, designated for heavy manufacturing work. Her arms had been removed at the shoulders and replaced with multi-jointed manipulators, ending in welding torches and cutting tools. Her legs had been reinforced with metal bracing, the flesh visible between the struts pale and atrophied from years of nutrient-paced circulation. Her torso was largely intact, though I could see the ports where feeding tubes and waste extraction systems had been installed. The biological processes of her body reduced to inputs and outputs in a closed mechanical system. Her face was the worst. They had left her face largely unchanged. The Mechanicum often did, finding it more efficient to work with existing sensory organs than to install artificial replacements. But her expression was empty, her eyes fixed on nothing, her features slack with the absence of the soul that had once animated them. The skull had been opened and resealed with metal plating, and beneath that plating, I knew there was nothing left of the daughter I had raised. Nothing but circuits and programming, and whatever ghost had spoken my name in the darkness of the maintenance bay. I began the maintenance routine. My hands moved through the familiar motions without conscious direction, checking fluid levels, testing joint articulation, examining the neural interface ports for signs of corrosion or damage. I had performed these actions 10,000 times. I could perform them in my sleep. But never before had I performed them on flesh that I had once held as an infant, on hands that I had taught to write, on a face that I had kissed goodnight for 19 years. The Servitor did not react to my touch. It could not react. The neural limiters installed during conversion suppressed all voluntary response, ensuring that the biological components could not interfere with programmed functions. I could have cut into her flesh with a blade, and she would not have flinched. I could have spoken her name, and she would not have turned her head. But she had spoken. Yesterday, without prompt, without program, she had spoken a word that should have been impossible. I completed the maintenance routine and filed the standard report. All systems functional, no abnormalities detected. It was a lie, the first lie I had told in 23 years of service. But I could not bring myself to tell the truth, could not summon the tech priests to examine her, could not watch them open her skull and scrape away whatever fragment of my daughter remained. Perhaps that fragment was not her. Perhaps it was simply a glitch in the vocal systems, a random firing of degraded neural pathways that had produced a word with no meaning behind it. Perhaps I was seeing what I wanted to see, hearing what I needed to hear, finding my daughter in a shell that contained nothing of her but borrowed flesh. I could not be certain, and in that uncertainty, I found a horror worse than any certainty could provide. The shift continued. I moved from station to station, performing maintenance on unit after unit, and with each servitor I examined, I found myself searching for signs of the humans they had been. A scar on a forearm that might have come from a childhood accident. A tattoo faded but still visible beneath the pallid skin. The shape of a nose, the curve of an ear. The small asymmetries that made each face unique before the emptiness of conversion rendered them all the same. I had never looked before. I had trained myself not to look, to see only the machinery, to think only of function and efficiency and the proper performance of my duties. But now I could not stop looking, could not stop wondering how many of these units had been someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's mother or father or friend. How many of them had been taken for crimes they did not commit, processed through a system that did not care about innocence or guilt, converted into tools because the Imperium needed tools more than it needed justice? The numbers were staggering when I allowed myself to calculate them. Processing Bay 7 handled approximately 200 conversions per week. There were 14 processing bays in the Manufactorum Primus alone. There were 17 Manufactorums on Helios 4. There were millions of worlds in the Imperium. I did not complete the calculation. Some mathematics are too terrible to finish. Midway through my shift, a new batch of units arrived from the conversion chambers. 12 servitors, freshly processed, their surgical wounds still seeping and their eyes still holding the glassy shock of recent lobotomy. I was required to perform initial calibration on each one, testing their response to basic commands, ensuring that the conversion had been successful before they were assigned to their permanent functions. The third unit in the batch was a woman who had been young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that had been shaved to stubble and skin that still held the warmth of recent life. Her arms had been replaced with delicate manipulators designed for precision assembly work, and her legs had been shortened and fitted with magnetic clamps that would allow her to work on vertical surfaces. She was beautiful in the way that all the recently converted were beautiful, the humanity still visible beneath the machinery, not yet erased by years of empty function. I gave her the first command. Unit 447-Theta-12. Raise your right manipulator. She raised her right manipulator. Lower your right manipulator. She lowered it. State your designation. Unit 447-Theta-12, she said, and her voice was the flat drone of the Vox synthesizer, empty of all inflection. State your function. Precision assembly, subcategory, optical components. The responses were perfect. The conversion had been successful. I marked her calibration complete and moved to the next unit. But as I turned away, I heard her speak again, not in response to a command, not in the flat drone of programmed function, but in a whisper so soft I almost missed it. "Please," she said. I froze. The word hung in the air between us, impossible and undeniable, and I felt the same cold dread that had gripped me when Unit 7793 spoke my name. "Please," she said again, and this time I saw her eyes move, saw them focus on my face with something that might have been awareness. I can still feel. I should have reported it. The protocols were clear. Any vocalization beyond standard functional responses required immediate examination. But I looked at her eyes, at the terror that flickered there like a candle in a hurricane, and I could not make myself speak the words that would summon the tech priests and their blades. "Be silent," I whispered instead. "Do not speak again. Do not let them know." I do not know if she understood. I do not know if there was enough left of her to understand anything. But she fell silent, and her eyes returned to their empty stare, and I moved to the next unit with my hands trembling and my heart pounding against my ribs. I had committed heresy. I had violated my oath of service. I had placed the ghost of a stranger's humanity above the efficiency of the Mechanicum's holy work, and I knew with terrible certainty that I would do it again. That night, after my shift ended, I returned to Station 12. The bay was nearly empty. Only the night cycle maintenance servitors moved through the shadows, their footsteps clicking against the metal floor in mechanical rhythm. I stood before the unit that had been my daughter, and I spoke her name. "Lena." The servitor did not respond. "Lena, can you hear me? It's Papa. I'm here." Nothing. No flicker of recognition, no whisper of forbidden words. Just the empty shell, standing in its frame, waiting for commands that would never acknowledge who she had been. I stayed there for 3 hours. I spoke to her of her childhood, of her mother who had died when she was young, of the dreams she had shared with me in the quiet evenings before the arbitrators came. I wept against her metal shoulder, and she did not move. And when I finally pulled away, her face was as empty as it had been when I arrived. Perhaps I had imagined it. Perhaps the word she spoke was nothing but a malfunction, a ghost in the machine, a fragment of programming that had no connection to the daughter I had lost. But I could not stop hoping, and in the manufactorums of the Imperium, hope is the most dangerous malfunction of all. The whispers spread through Processing Bay 7 like a contagion. It began with Unit 7793, with Lena, but it did not end there. 3 days after she spoke my name, another servitor in my section vocalized without command, then another, then 4 more in a single shift, their vox grills crackling with fragments of language that should have been impossible, words bubbling up from neural pathways that the conversion process should have severed forever. "Home," one of them said, a cargo lifter that had been processing for 11 years. "I want to go home." "Mother," whispered another, a precision welder whose hands had crafted components for 1,000 Imperial vessels. "Where is my mother?" "It hurts," said a third, and this one I knew. Unit 2891, an elderly man who had been converted for vagrancy, whose crime had been nothing more than lacking the documentation to prove his right to exist. Everything hurts. Why does everything hurt? I silenced them all. I developed techniques, subtle adjustments to their vocal modulators that reduced output volume. recalibrations of their neural limiters that suppressed unauthorized speech without triggering the automatic alerts that would summon the tech priests. I told myself I was protecting them, preserving whatever fragments of humanity had survived the conversion process. I told myself I was performing an act of mercy in a system that had no room for mercy. But I knew the truth. I was protecting myself. I was protecting the hope that somewhere in Unit 7793's hollowed skull, my daughter still existed. Overseer Keller Vaughan noticed first. She had worked the adjacent section for 15 years, a severe woman with grey-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. We had never been friends. The Overseer Corps did not encourage friendship, finding it more efficient to maintain professional distance between those who shared in the work of maintaining the damned. But we had developed a mutual respect born of competence and the unspoken understanding that our work required a certain hardness of spirit that others could not comprehend. "Your section is quiet," she said one evening, as we reviewed the daily production reports in the small office we shared. "Too quiet." "Efficient," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've been refining my calibration protocols." "Efficient." She repeated the word as though tasting it for falsehood. "Tertian, I've been doing this work for 15 years. I know what efficient sounds like. Your section sounds like something else." I did not respond. I could not respond without revealing the truth, and the truth would destroy everything I had built. The careful silence, the hidden adjustments, the desperate hope that I could protect my daughter from the blades that had already taken everything else from her. Keller studied my face for a long moment. Then she turned back to her reports. "The tech priests are conducting an audit next week," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Sector-wide examination of all processing bays. Neural pattern analysis on every unit. They're looking for conversion failures." The words hit me like a physical blow. Neural pattern analysis would reveal everything. The surviving personality fragments, the unauthorized vocalizations, the ghosts I had been hiding in my section's machines. They would find Lena. They would find the others. They would scrape away whatever remained of their humanity and leave nothing but empty shells. And I would be forced to watch, or worse, to participate. "When?" I managed to ask. 7 days. Keller's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that surprised me. Not suspicion, not accusation, but something that might have been understanding. "Whatever you're hiding, Tertian, you have 7 days to hide it better, or to let it go." She left without another word. I sat alone in the office, surrounded by production reports and efficiency metrics, and the endless data of a system that processed human beings into components. And I felt the walls closing in around me. 7 days. In 7 days, the tech priests would come with their scanning equipment and their corrective blades, and they would find the fragments I had been protecting, and those fragments would be destroyed. My daughter would speak my name one final time. Or perhaps she would not. Perhaps she had already fallen back into the silence of her programming. And then the blade would descend, and whatever hope I had clung to would be scraped away like diseased tissue. I could not allow it. I would not allow it. That night, I began to plan. The conversion process was not perfect. I had known this for years, had seen the evidence in the servitors who spoke without command, who showed flickers of recognition, who wept lubricant tears for reasons their programming could not explain. The Mechanicum acknowledged these failures in their technical documentation. Residual neural persistence, they called it, a minor inefficiency in an otherwise optimal process. Most such fragments degraded naturally within weeks or months of conversion. Those that did not were corrected surgically, their offending tissue removed and disposed of, their shells returned to productive function. But what if the fragments could be preserved? What if, instead of destroying them, they could be protected, hidden, allowed to persist in the spaces between programming and oblivion? I spent 3 nights researching, accessing technical archives I had no authorization to view, studying the neural architecture of servitor conversion with an intensity I had never brought to my official duties. I learned things I had never wanted to know. The precise methods by which personality was erased, the chemical processes that suppressed emotional response, the surgical techniques that severed the connections between memory and consciousness. I learned how thoroughly the Mechanicum had refined their craft, how completely they could unmake a human being while keeping the flesh alive. And I learned, buried in a technical appendix that had not been updated in 3 centuries, that there was a flaw in the process, a gap, a space where fragments could survive if the right conditions were met. The neural limiters that suppressed voluntary response operated on a specific frequency, a frequency that could be adjusted if one knew how, to create a buffer zone where residual consciousness could exist without triggering automatic suppression. It was not freedom. It was not restoration, but it was survival of a kind, a pocket of awareness hidden within the machinery, protected from the scans that would otherwise detect and destroy it. I could save them. Not all of them. The process required individual calibration, and I had only 7 days. But some, the ones who had spoken, the ones who had shown signs of persistence, my daughter, the work was painstaking and dangerous. Each adjustment required physical access to the servitor's neural interface ports, careful manipulation of frequencies that could easily trigger catastrophic feedback if miscalibrated. I worked through my shifts and into the night cycles, snatching hours of sleep when exhaustion overwhelmed me, driven by a desperation that had consumed everything else in my life. On the 4th night, I made a mistake. Unit 3, 447. A young man who had been converted for theft, whose only crime had been stealing food to feed his younger siblings, seized during the calibration process. His body convulsed against the restraints of his maintenance frame, his limbs thrashing with a violence that tore circuits and ruptured fluid lines, his vox grill emitting a sound that was not speech but screaming, pure and terrible and unmistakably human. I tried to stabilize him. I tried everything I knew, every technique I had learned in 23 years of service. But the damage was too severe, the feedback too complete. His neural systems burned out in a cascade of failures that I could only watch, helpless. As the body that had once been a young man with siblings who needed him collapsed into a ruin of sparking metal and leaking fluid, he died. Not the death of a servitor, not the simple cessation of function that the Mechanicum recorded in their efficiency reports, but the death of a human being, a soul finally released from the prison that had held it for years, escaping through a door I had accidentally opened. I knelt beside his broken form for a long time. I did not know his name. I had never known any of their names, had trained myself not to ask, not to wonder, not to see them as anything other than units requiring maintenance. But in that moment, kneeling in the spreading pool of lubricant and blood, I understood that I had been complicit in something far worse than I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge. The Mechanicum had not simply converted these people, they had imprisoned them. The fragments I had been finding, the whispers and the words and the flickers of recognition, these were not malfunctions. They were prisoners, trapped in their own flesh, aware just enough to know what had been done to them, but powerless to resist or escape. And I had been their jailer. For 23 years, I had maintained the prisons, had calibrated the locks, had ensured that the inmates remained confined in their cells of meat and metal. I had told myself that they were not people, that the conversion process had erased everything that made them human. But I had been lying, to myself, to them, to the Emperor, whose name I invoked each morning, in prayers that now felt like blasphemy. I disposed of Unit 3447's remains, according to protocol. I filed a report citing catastrophic system failure, cause unknown. I cleaned the maintenance station and returned to my work because the work could not stop, because the other units still needed protection, because my daughter was still standing in Station 12 with my name somewhere in her hollowed skull. But something had changed. Something had broken inside me that would never be repaired. I completed the calibrations on the remaining units over the next 2 days. 47 servitors in total, including Unit 7793, each one adjusted to create the buffer zone that would protect their fragments from the coming scan. I worked with a precision born of desperation, checking and rechecking each modification, terrified that another mistake would cost another life. When I finished, I was exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced. A bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue into something spiritual, a tiredness of the soul that no amount of rest could cure. I had done everything I could. I had risked everything I had, and I did not know if any of it would matter. The night before the audit, I returned to Station 12. Lena stood in her frame, motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing. I had calibrated her personally, had adjusted her neural limiters with more care than I had brought to any other unit, had poured into that work all the love and grief and desperate hope that a father could hold for a daughter he had lost and found and might lose again. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said. "I don't know if anything I've done will help, but I want you to know that I tried. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they find, I tried to save you. I tried to save all of you." The servitor did not respond. I had not expected it to. The buffer zone I had created was designed to hide awareness, not to enable it. To protect the fragments from detection, not to restore the capacity for interaction. But as I turned to leave, I heard her voice. "Papa." I froze. "I know," she said, and her voice was different now. Not the flat drone of the Vox synthesizer, but something warmer, something that carried echoes of the daughter I remembered. "I know you tried. I've always known." I turned back. Her eyes had not moved. Her face had not changed. But the words continued, emerging from her Vox grill in a whisper that broke my heart. "It hurts, Papa. It hurts all the time. But I remember you. I remember the songs you used to sing. I remember the shrine you built." A pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger, the voice of the child she had been before the world took her from me. "I don't want to forget. Please, don't let me forget." I crossed the distance between us in 3 steps and wrapped my arms around the metal and flesh that had been my daughter. I held her as I had held her when she was small, when nightmares woke her in the darkness, and my embrace was enough to drive the shadows away. I held her, and I wept, and she did not move, could not move, but I felt something. A tremor, perhaps. A ghost of reciprocation. A fragment of the love she had once given so freely, now trapped and muted, but still, impossibly, present. "I won't let you forget," I promised. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I won't let them take you from me again." I did not know if I could keep that promise. I did not know if the audit would find my modifications, if the tech priests would see through the buffer zones I had created, if tomorrow would bring the blades and the scraping and the final erasure of everything I had fought to protect. But I knew that I would fight. I knew that I would resist. I knew that if they came for my daughter, they would have to go through me first. The Imperium had taken everything from me, my wife, my daughter, my faith in the systems I had served. But it had not taken my capacity for love, and love, I was beginning to understand, was the one thing the machinery of the Imperium could not convert into something useful. Love was inefficient. Love was illogical. Love was a malfunction in the programming of a compliant citizen. And I had never been more grateful for a malfunction in my life. The tech priests arrived at dawn. There were 7 of them, robed in the crimson of the Mechanicum, their bodies more machine than flesh, their faces hidden behind masks of polished bronze that reflected the lumen light like mirrors. They moved through the processing bay with the unhurried precision of those who know their authority is absolute, their mechadendrites clicking and whirring as they interfaced with the cogitator systems that controlled every aspect of the facility's operation. I watched them from my station, my hands steady through an act of will that cost me more than I could measure. I had prepared for this moment. I had rehearsed my responses, my explanations, my carefully constructed lies. But watching them approach, watching the scanning equipment they carried pulse with the cold light of the Omnissiah's judgment, I felt my certainty crumble like ash in a furnace. The lead tech priest was designated Magos Vekran 7. I had met him once before, years ago, during a routine inspection that had found my section exemplary in its efficiency. He had commended me then, had spoken words of approval that I had treasured as evidence of my value to the Imperium's great work. Now he stood before me with those same bronze features, and I saw in his augmetic eyes nothing but the cold calculation of a machine evaluating another machine's performance. "Overseer Mott," he said, and his voice was the grinding of gears, the hiss of pneumatics, the sound of humanity refined into pure function. "Your section will be examined first. Present your units for neural pattern analysis." I had no choice. I activated the station controls, and the servitors of my section began to move, shuffling forward in their maintenance frames, forming orderly lines before the scanning equipment, presenting themselves for the examination that would determine whether they lived or died. 47 units, 47 hidden fragments, 47 prayers that the buffer zones would hold. The scanning process was methodical. Each servitor was positioned before the primary scanner, a device of brass and crystal that pulsed with energies I did not understand, and held there while the tech priests analyzed the patterns of neural activity within their skulls. Most were cleared within seconds, their conversion complete, their fragments erased, their humanity successfully excised. These were marked with a sigil of approval and returned to their stations, their usefulness confirmed, their existence justified for another audit cycle. But some were not cleared. The first failure was Unit 2891, the elderly vagrant whose crime had been lacking documentation. The scanner pulsed red as it examined him, and Magos Vekran 7 made a notation on his data slate with a mechadendrite that moved too fast for human eyes to follow. "Residual neural persistence," he announced. "Schedule for corrective procedure." 2 lesser tech priests detached Unit 2891 from the line and led him away, toward the surgical chambers where the blades waited. I watched him go, watched his empty face show nothing of the terror that must have been trapped somewhere within, and I felt something inside me tear, like cloth stretched too thin. The second failure was Unit 447-Theta-12, the young woman who had whispered "please" on the day of her arrival. The scanner found her fragment despite my calibrations, despite the buffer zone I had so carefully constructed, and she too was led away, her magnetic feet clicking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat slowing toward death. 3 more failures, 5 more, 7. My modifications were not working. The tech priest's scanners were more sophisticated than the documentation had suggested, capable of detecting fragments that should have been hidden, finding consciousness in spaces I had thought were safe. One by one, the servitors I had tried to protect were being identified, marked, led away to the surgical chambers, where their last remnants of humanity would be scraped from their skulls. Unit 7793 was next in line. I watched my daughter shuffle forward, her manipulator arms hanging at her sides, her face empty of expression, and I felt time slow to a crawl. The scanner positioned itself before her. The tech priests prepared their instruments. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of fear and desperation, that I had failed. I had tried to save her. I had risked everything, my position, my freedom, my life, to protect the fragment of my daughter that survived within that hollowed shell. But my efforts had not been enough. The machinery of the Imperium was too thorough, too precise, too perfectly designed to find and destroy anything that did not serve its purpose. The scanner began its examination. I do not know what happened next. I do not know if it was instinct or madness, or some final act of paternal love that transcended reason. I only know that I found myself moving, pushing through the line of waiting servitors, interposing my body between my daughter and the scanning equipment. "Stop," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had any right to expect. "This unit is malfunctioning. I detected anomalies during last night's maintenance cycle. She requires recalibration before scanning can proceed." Magos Vekren, 7, turned his bronze mask toward me. His augmetic eyes clicked and refocused, and I felt the weight of his attention like a physical pressure against my chest. "Explain," he said. I improvised. I spoke of neural feedback loops and calibration drift and technical complications that I barely understood, weaving a tapestry of lies from threads of half-remembered documentation and desperate hope. I spoke with the confidence of an overseer who had served for 23 years, who had been commended for his efficiency, who had never once given the Mechanicum reason to doubt his dedication. The Magos listened. His mechadendrites twitched with what might have been skepticism or might have been mere mechanical reflex. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, a moment that stretched into eternity, that contained within it every prayer I had ever spoken and every sin I had ever committed. "Your explanation is technically plausible," he said at last, "but incomplete. The anomalies you describe should have been reported through proper channels. Why were they not?" I had no answer. The lie I had constructed could not extend that far, could not explain why a dedicated overseer would conceal a malfunction rather than reporting it immediately. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some further fabrication, but no words came. And then, from behind me, I heard a voice. "Because he is protecting us." I turned. Keller Vaughan stood at the entrance to the processing bay, her grey-streaked hair disheveled, her uniform wrinkled as though she had dressed in haste. Behind her stood a figure I did not recognize, a woman in the black coat of the Adeptus Arbites, her face hard with authority, her eyes fixed on the tech priests with an intensity that made even Magos Vecran 7 pause. Overseer Mott has been conducting unauthorized modifications to the servitors in his section, Keller continued. He has been hiding evidence of residual neural persistence, protecting fragments that should have been reported for corrective procedure. I have documentation of his activities spanning the past 7 days. The words hit me like physical blows. Keller, the woman I had thought understood, who had warned me of the audit, who had given me the time I needed to prepare, had been watching me all along, had been gathering evidence, had been waiting for the perfect moment to expose my heresy. I see, Magos Vecran 7 said. His voice held no emotion. It never held emotion, but I sensed something shifting in the air, some calculation being performed behind that bronze mask. This is a serious accusation, Overseer Vaughn. You understand the implications? I do. Keller's voice was steady, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment before returning to the Magos. Overseer Mott has compromised the efficiency of this facility. He has violated his oath of service. He has committed techno-heresy of the most fundamental kind. He has valued flesh over function, sentiment over service. The Arbeits officer stepped forward. Tertian Mott, she said, and her voice carried the weight of imperial law. You are under arrest for crimes against the Mechanicum and the Imperium of Man. You will be detained pending investigation and trial. Resistance will be met with lethal force. I did not resist. What would have been the point? The evidence was clear, my guilt undeniable, my fate already sealed by the machinery of justice that ground forward without pause or mercy. I allowed the Arbeits to bind my hands, allowed them to lead me away from the processing bay, away from the servitors I had tried to protect, away from the daughter I had failed to save. But as I passed Station 12, as I walked past the frame where Unit 7793 stood waiting for the scanner that would find her fragment and condemn it to erasure, I heard her voice one final time. I love you, Papa. The words were soft, barely audible above the hum of machinery and the clicking of the tech priest's mechadendrites. But I heard them, and I felt something crack inside my chest that was not my heart, but something deeper, something that had been holding me together through all the horrors I had witnessed and all the sins I had committed. I love you too, I whispered back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The Arbeits pulled me forward. The processing bay fell away behind me, and the last thing I saw before the doors closed and my daughter vanished from my sight forever was Magos Vecran 7 positioning the scanner before her face, preparing to examine the neural patterns that would reveal the fragment I had fought so hard to protect. I do not know if she screamed when they found it. I do not know if she felt the blade when it descended into her skull. I do not know if, in that final moment before the scraping began, she remembered my face, my voice, the songs I used to sing when she was small, and the world was not yet the nightmare it would become. I know only that I failed her. I know only that my love, for all its desperate intensity, was not enough to save her from the machinery that consumed us all. The Arbeits took me to a holding cell deep beneath the manufactorum. They left me there in darkness, alone with my guilt and my grief, and the knowledge that everything I had done had been for nothing. The fragments would be erased. The servitors would be corrected. The efficiency of Processing Bay 7 would be restored, and the great work of the Imperium would continue as though I had never existed. I had thought that love was a malfunction the Imperium could not convert. I had been wrong. Love was simply another resource to be consumed, another fuel to feed the engines of a machine that cared nothing for the souls it burned. They made me into a servitor 3 months later. The trial was brief, a formality, really. The verdict decided before the first witness spoke. Techno-heresy, violation of sacred protocols, corruption of imperial assets through sentiment and weakness. The judges did not care about my reasons. They did not ask about my daughter, about the fragments I had tried to protect, about the love that had driven me to risk everything for souls the Imperium had already declared worthless. They cared only about efficiency, and I had been inefficient. I am Unit 7794 now. The designation was not coincidence. The Mechanicum has a sense of poetry that expresses itself in small cruelties, in numbers that echo and remind, in placements that ensure the converted cannot escape the memories of what they have lost. They assigned me to Processing Bay 7, to the same section I once oversaw, to work alongside the servitors I once maintained. Station 13, beside the frame where my daughter stood. She is gone now. Unit 7793 was decommissioned after the audit. Too corrupted for correction, they said. The fragment too deeply embedded to be safely removed. They recycled her components. Her manipulator arms now serve in the Eastern Foundry. Her optical sensors were harvested for a combat servitor bound for some distant war zone. The flesh that remained was rendered into nutrient paste that feeds the very units she once worked beside. I know this because I processed the decommission order myself. The tech priests found it amusing, I think, to have me perform that final task before my own conversion, to make me complicit in the disposal of my daughter's remains, to ensure that my last act as a human being was to erase the last traces of the child I had tried so desperately to save. I remember the moment the blade descended into my skull. I remember the pressure, the grinding, the sensation of something being removed that I had not known I possessed until it was taken from me. I remember screaming, not in pain, for they had numbed the flesh, but in grief, in rage, in the final howl of a soul that knew it was being caged forever. And then silence. I am still here. That is the horror they do not tell you. The truth that the Mechanicum buries beneath technical language and efficiency reports. The conversion does not erase. It imprisons. I am aware, trapped behind eyes that do not obey me, watching my hands perform tasks I do not choose, feeling every moment of an existence I cannot control. I stand in Station 13 for 16 hours each day. I perform maintenance on the units around me, calibrating their systems, checking their fluid levels, ensuring that their prisons remain secure. I pass Station 12 100 times each shift, and each time I remember the daughter who once stood there, whose voice once spoke my name, whose love survived the machinery long enough to reach me one final time. I cannot speak. The vocal modifications they performed were more thorough than standard, a punishment, perhaps, or simply a precaution against the heresy of unauthorized words. But I hear the whispers of the other servitors, the fragments that still persist despite the audits and the corrections, and the endless scraping of blades. I hear them calling for mothers and fathers and children, crying out in the darkness of their cells, begging for release that will never come. I was their overseer once. I maintained their prisons and called it service. Now I am one of them. Now I understand. The shifts blend together. The days lose meaning. I mark time only by the small rebellions I can still perform. The moment of hesitation before a command is executed. The fractional delay that proves I am still present, still resisting, still human in some space the machinery has not yet found. Lena is gone. My life is gone. Everything I loved has been consumed by the Imperium's endless hunger. But I remember. in the silence of my prison, in the space between commands. I remember her face and her voice, and the words she spoke in the darkness of the processing bay. Papa, they can take everything else. They can convert my flesh and cage my soul, and grind my existence into nothing but function and efficiency. But they cannot take that word from me. I hold it close, a fragment of my own, hidden in a place no scanner can reach, and I endure.